Mumbai Research Centre of the Asiatic Society of Mumbai is pleased to present Jashan-e-Dastan in Mumbai 2023. The theme this year is on the streets, celebrating the city's vivid street lives. This evening, Streetscapes, Past, Present and Imagined is a combination of an illustrated tour by architect Robert Stephans, author of Bombay Imagined. After completing his Bachelor of Architecture degree from Virginia Tech in 2007, Robert Stephans left his childhood hometown of Summerville, South Carolina and moved to Mumbai, India. Their loss, our gain. He joined RMA Architects as an apprentice at the age of 22 and is now a principal at the same firm. Robert is part of the core team at RMA, responsible for recent additions to Mumbai's built environment, including the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Vastu Sangrahalaya Visitors Centre and Children's Museum at Kala Ghoda. So, thank you, and over to you, Robert.
Yeah, I also.
It's to dim. Lights make me very nervous. Yeah, much better. You can't see me, then I feel less nervous. No, thank you all for coming. It's a really nice, intimate group, and I'm really happy I know almost everyone here. So that also helps with the nerves a bit. So you all know me, I'm Robert Stephans. But I've gone by a few names. One is, of course, Mr. Robert. One is Mr. Robot. Robert Stephans. Robert Stepan. Stephen Probert. This one was tricky right there. And Robert Stephans, of course. But my favorite, Robert Bhai. 35 coffee. And this was a receipt for just 2 days. Huh? I love coffee. So, no, I've gone by many names. Thank you for coming. Bill Bryson, modifications and providential tinkerings. I really like this quote. A musty archive of adjustments, right? And I think our cities are in many ways similar to this. 2006, I had never been to Mumbai. Very little about the city apart from having read Maximum City by Suketu Mehta. And I had a dream about a week before I came to Bombay. I came with 2 friends from college. And this is real, this is not a joke. I love humor. There will be some humor in this talk, but this is not a joke. It's completely true. I actually had a dream the week before I came to Bombay. And in that dream, I was on a street. I was in a white car. I was driving the car. The road was fine. We were going forward. And I was alone in the car. And then there appeared a pothole in the street. Okay? And then there were 2 potholes, and then 3. And the road kind of eroded away, and then we were just driving on dirt. I was just driving on dirt. It was very slow, the car, but it was moving forward, and didn't feel any danger. Everything felt fine. It was just a very slow, tedious process. So I had that dream. I was in South Carolina at the time, came to Bombay a week later, and I saw a scene similar to this. I was staying in Thane and in Malund for that first trip, and I could not believe my eyes. Now, this is a recent image. I did not take an image of that kind of image I saw in Thane in 2006, but it was just like this. The street was gone. And I remember being amazed because it looked exactly like what I had seen in that dream. And I consider that like what Bill Bryson calls a providential tinkering, right? It's something happens and you just feel like it's a sign. So I went back to college. Before that, these were some of the images I took in that first trip. And as I was going through my archives, I realized I just took a lot of photographs of streets. I loved the streets. You see this yellow dot at the top left of the image. All the images with yellow dots were from that first trip. This was a street in Thane. This was, of course, Marine Drive. I cannot remember where this was, but I like it. Similar, probably Thane or Malund. And then I believe this was the Eastern Express Highway. But it was all images of streets, predominantly. And I went back to university. I had 1 year left. but I said I'm going to work in Bombay. I'm going to find a place to work and live. I searched and searched, didn't find anything, and eventually stumbled upon Rahul Mehrotra and Associates. I wrote to Rahul, said I'd like to work with you. He said, you're nuts. Let's try it for 6 months. We tried it, and now 16 years later, we're still going strong. But I came in 2007. When I came to Bombay, our office was in 4 Jet Street in Tardeo. For those of you that know Tardeo, I stayed at MP Mills, an SRA scheme. This was just outside where I lived. And every weekend I would walk the streets. I absolutely loved walking the streets, and I just continued to be amazed because you could find anything. Fruit, dry fruit. There was, of course, the trains, shoes. You could have anything fixed on the street. It was just fabulous. And sitafal. I love sitafal. So I really enjoyed the streets. Every weekend I would walk. And then I started to notice, during the monsoon, Tardeo especially, it would just flood. And I was overwhelmed that, every inch of this part of town was flooded. And nobody seemed bothered. A year later, 2009, this is that flyover outside Grant Road Station. It was flooded. The next year, same thing. Year after year, this kept happening. And, I was just perplexed. So I started to do a bit of research. And I realized 2 things. It's maybe obvious if you're from Bombay, but it was new for me. You have this unique combination of course, the monsoon and then high tide, right? And this is kind of this very intense pressure on the city. And then combined with that, you have the fact that the original city, of course, is multiple islands, right? The very center of the present metropolis is depressed. This is coming back to those small adjustments that make an archive, that make the city, Bombay's the same. And this fundamental problem of the center of the island being the lowest part, right? It's like a bathtub. And this causes a problem for the cities, the challenge of geography and meteorology. So the city is a musty archive of adjustments. And this was one attempted adjustment by Captain Johnson in 1720. He called it the Great Channel. And he sought to deal with this question of high tide and monsoon simultaneously kind of hammering the bathtub. And this was his scheme. His proposal is to cut a channel across the island. And Captain Johnson wrote extensively about this idea, this channel cut through the heart of what would become the rest of the city. He wrote about it. There was no visual material for his proposal, so we created what we call speculations. And speculations combine the rigor of the historian with the wild creativity of the artist. I really like this combination of the two. This was a sketch that I made based on Captain Johnson's writings, and then Aniketu Maria made this speculation, this 3D piece of art based on all historical data. In the foreground you can see Haji Ali, and that's Captain Johnson's channel cut straight across the island from west to east. And the intent was simple. When monsoon hits, when high tide comes and they happen together, this kind of force of water just gets channeled through this channel and not into the rest of the city. And I'd like to think if this had been successful, this is Haji Ali, that was Johnson's cut, had it worked, had it been done and worked, Bombay might have had this series of cuts all the way across. It would have become like a Venice, like an Oriental Venice, perhaps. And this is an interesting idea that Jamshedi Tata also floated in 1900, this idea of an Oriental Venice. And he specifically looked at Juhu. And he said there's this parcel of land in Juhu, it's like an island at high tide, it's inundated. And he said, let's cut 500 one-acre plots into this inundated land, and all of it would be accessed by waterways. Every piece of, every one-acre plot would be accessed by canal. This is, of course, Juhu today. It was all filled up, as we know. But this is what I think all of the approaches to these plots might have looked like. It would have been truly an Oriental Venice. It would have been Bombay's first and only residential development without a single street. Of course, Bombay didn't go that route, and we ended up developing many, many streets. This is one of them, of course, just outside the Fort District. This is MG Road. This image is from the RMA Archive. If any of you know RMA, it's a fabulous collection here in Bombay. But you see the streets here. And This is how they were described, as great factories of dust. Right? All the streets were but compacted earth. They were great factories of dust. And this gentleman, William Walker, came to Bombay in 1845 and experienced these factories of dust and had many ideas. And this was one of them. He called it the Freetown Trenches. And he basically looked at the streets and said on each side of the street we should have these channels, these canals of water. This was the plan. The open side trenches would have a marked effect in keeping the air cool, and men with scoops could keep the roads watered at a trifling expense. So from these channels, water was to be scooped, thrown onto the street, and it would keep the dust at bay and cool the entire city at the same time, he imagined. So this was a speculation. William Walker wrote poetically about his scheme, but there was no visual. So this is what I thought the street might have looked like. I thought perhaps there would still be these water bubbles on the mud roads before the water settled completely. And I gave this sketch to two rendering artists in Europe, and this is what they came up with. It's really, really beautiful. I feel it's fabulous detail. If you zoom in, this is one of Bombay Gothic buildings reflected in this kind of very fine layer of moisture on the top of the road. This is where the carriage wheel would have hit that compacted earth, and then of course the reflective bubble, which they just made really beautifully. So I really enjoyed this work. This is Yanis. He worked with Lambros together to make this piece, and they made about 6 or 7 pieces in the book. Now, this evening, as we walk through Bombay streets, some real, some imagined, I want you to also imagine like we're walking a street and you're meeting people along the way. So Yanis is one of them. He's a really, really sweet guy and very talented. So William Walker's imagining these trenches on either side of the street, and then he has more ideas. He looks at the street lights and says, how can we improve Bombay's lighting, right? And then he comes up with this scheme that he calls luminous cremation. Now, he looks around, he sees various cremation grounds around the city, and they're of course just open to sky, open spaces. And this is what he comes up with. It's a bit of a long read, so just kind of hunker down, bear with me for a minute. This is Walker's words. Fastidious people may be shocked and startled at the scheme, but on what reasonable grounds? Is a man of mark whose whole life has been devoted to the enlightenment of his fellow countrymen to be quenched from our sight forever by the fell stroke of death and leave but a scintillating ray behind? Forbidded economy and common sense, does it cost nothing, thank you, to clothe the ribs with rich store of carbon, that it should be afterwards wasted in the desert air, the very marrow of our complaint? Would it not create a sweetly mournful feeling in our breast to see that, although our friend be dead, yet meteor-like as in life, he was shedding an effulgent ray to dispel the darkness before seeking the flowing galaxy of light in the other world? Fabulous, so poetic. Bear with me. Why did Walker want to light the streets? Right? I spent days thinking about this. Like, why would he spend so much time developing this radical scheme that the gas from cremation is pumped throughout the city to light up street lamps as symbolic acts? And it just was obvious because he was a walker, right? Yeah, thank you. One laugh, thank you. So I love walking, much like Walker, like many of you. There's some walkers here. This was Malund. And many people in Bombay like walking. 51% of commuters' daily trips are on foot, right? And you would think the pedestrian infrastructure has followed that, but unfortunately it's always been a few steps behind. This is the early 1860s, and what you see here is a street section, as intended by the municipal commissioners. And as you can see, as in all good urban design, the footpath is slightly above the main carriageway, the main road. Now, unfortunately, 1860s, we have the same problems then as we do today. What was actually constructed was ulta, and the footpath was actually below the main roadway. The Bombay builder was not happy about this. They published this section as a critique, and then they wrote this. It is a well-known axiom in road making that the surface of footway should never be under the level of the middle of the contiguous roadway, right? Basically, they were furious when this happened. And fast forward 2016, this is the municipal corporation. It's an official manifesto they published a few years ago. They say this: In order to be effective, the sidewalks, as far as possible and practicable, should be provided on both sides of the road above the level of the carriageway, separated by curbs. So it's crazy, this basic requirement of a footpath being above a road is just constantly kind of faltering, and yet people are saying this is, you know, how a good footpath needs to be. William Walker again, you'll see I really like him. Bombay Imagined, which has many of these projects, it's actually dedicated to him. He had many ideas, one of which was called the Back Bay Crescent and Promenade Company. And basically he looked upon Back Bay and he said, this is where we should have a lush promenade, right? This is 1861. This, you can see the footprint here very faintly. That was his plan. And this was the scheme from Chowpatty to Churchgate, a publicly accessible 30-meter wide landscaped promenade, about double the width of today's Marine Drive. By comparison, this was to be fully landscaped, only for pedestrian use, no vehicular movement. And a few decades before Walker made the scheme, this is what Back Bay, the Marine Drive promenade today, looked like. There were, of course, cremations going on the sands. There was a cemetery, burial ground. And a man by the name of Henry Croneybeare, who designed many of Bombay's water systems, he looked upon this scene and said there should be no cremations, the burial ground should go to Malabar Hill, and this should become what he calls a marine parade. Right? He was the first person in the city's history to identify this arc, this sweep, as a special moment for people, for every city resident. He was, of course, unsuccessful at the time. But what I find most interesting is his analysis of Malabar Hill. He says this: the eastern slope of Malabar Hill is not adapted for building purposes, but it is finely broken and might be laid out and planted into a very picturesque cemetery. Right? Amazing. And this, of course, is Malabar Hill's eastern slope. This is as of 2006. This is from that first trip, the yellow dot. Croneybeare, I think, would have been overwhelmed to have seen this. The same area, Back Bay, gentlemen, we're going to talk and explore some of Robert Fairbairn's work. Now, he's also, like Walker, I really like him because he struggled, and you'll see why. This was his plan. This drawing is actually in this building. It's here at the Asiatic Library. As far as I know, this is the only copy in the world, and it's here. And this was his plan. If you look closely, this is Malabar Point, Malabar Hill, the very tip. This is Colaba Point, and this is roughly Churchgate, the western edge of Fort. And Robert Fairbairn basically said the entire space should be reclaimed, entirety of Back Bay. And he called it Freerstown, the new Freerstown. This entire thing, the new town would have been 25 times larger than Bombay's Fort District. It was gigantic. And this was it. It included, if you look very faintly, you can see all the crossroads planned in dotted lines. It's the whole array of roads, whole new town. It was to have both the GIP and the Bombay-Baroda Railway terminus in Back Bay. And then, of course, a huge number of docks. Hundreds, thousands of ships were to be accommodated in this area. That's Churchgate for reference. And just enormous development. But this text I really like. It's a lot. I'm going to read it. If you want to just close your eyes and listen, maybe that's good, or you can read along. But just listen closely. The unfortunate man has been, and this unfortunate man is Robert Fairbairn, who made this scheme. The unfortunate man has been for the last 12 or 14 years subject to epileptic fits and was under treatment for them in the European General Hospital for 14 months when he was discharged as incurable. Since then, the poor fellow has not been fit for much, and anyone not aware of the complaint from which he suffers would take him to be under the influence of liquor for hours after an attack. Lately, he has not been accountable for his actions and would often walk, he was a walker, miles without any knowledge of having done so, and would exhibit other forms of absent-mindedness. The fits usually attack him once or twice a month, and then always at spring tides or when the moon is full. It's very interesting. Between the attacks, he is fairly well and equal to working out the most abstruse engineering calculations. For some years past, his bed has been under a tree on the Esplanade during the fair season, and in a shed in the fort during the monsoons, and I have known him during the night to mentally work out some complicated problems and put them into black and white in the early morning. Mr. Fairborn is about 60 years of age and hails from a good family in the north of England, and is now believed to have a claim for a large sum of money against government. I may also mention that it was he who prepared plans for the proposed docks at the Back Bay reclamation. I find that fascinating. It's amazing, amazing. Of course, he failed completely. He died and was buried at Suri Cemetery, and there were 4 people at his burial. A few years later, Back Bay reclamation kind of resurfaces. This time it's at a much smaller scale, although still, of course, too big to be realized. What you see in green was kind of the most famous Back Bay proposal, 1,500 acres. It actually started and then stopped after 300 acres had been done when the American Civil War ended, but this was the scheme. And about 5 decades later, the scheme comes back, led by George Buchanan, another engineer. And this was the proposal at that time. What's in red, of course, was the existing city footprint. What's in yellow was the proposed scheme. And Buchanan's plan was simple. He said, from the bottom of the harbor, let's scoop mud. Okay, let's pump it in these big, huge pipes across Colaba and dump it on the rocky foreshore behind a retaining wall. Right? It was a simple plan, quite doable. However, the only problem, that seawall they created, it leaked like a tap. And all the mud just oozed right in the Back Bay. So it was this kind of Sisyphean cycle, huge disaster. The project, of course, completely fell apart. And this is what someone said in 1927. We are now condemned to gaze at something which, to put it in homely language, looks like nothing on earth. Right? And I love that quote. This is the same area today, about 2017. It does indeed look like nothing on earth. I agree. That's the leaky seawall in the foreground, still floating in Back Bay. And in 1974, Charles Correa was approached to make a plan for this incomplete reclamation. And this is what he came up with. This is the leaky seawall. And it was basically this gigantic public space. There were to be a planetarium, art centers, halls, public halls, design school. It was to have a lot, and all within more or less the existing footprint of the reclamation. He described it as an event for the city, a new and unique waterfront, unprecedented in the contemporary Indian urban scene. And this was one of the drawings he made. It's a huge drawing. I've seen it in real life. It's probably 4 or 5 feet wide by 3 feet tall. It's really, really beautiful. And there are a lot of walkers. Right? I really like this. And that was, of course, part of the design. This is what Correa said. The profile of the existing reclamation has been modified marginally so as to create a variety of spaces of different sizes and degrees of privacy, scaled not to the motor car, but to the human being. Right? That's really nice. I like that. I think of streets, right? You see a lot of people on streets. We meet people on streets. Correa was making this promenade street along the waterfront. And of course, there were also high-rise buildings in this plan. Correa talks a lot about this proposal by Le Corbusier for Air India Tower. And he spoke about it at least twice to journalists, separated by decades. And this is what Correa said. Can you imagine what would have happened if Corbusier had built this building at the end of Marine Drive? It would have been an architectural gesture that would have changed our lives. 10 or 20 other people driving down Marine Drive would have been inspired to create a building like that. It would have changed our city. Right? I love, every time I hear this story, I think of my favorite works by Corbusier, and my imagination just runs wild. Same part of the city, Feroz Kudianwala proposed a 102-story tower in the 1960s. That was quite unheard of at the time, as the highest tower at the time was 24 floors. This was to be 102. And the same, of course, same South Bombay. This is a proposal by OMA in the Netherlands for a building called India Tower. It was unfortunately a pie in the sky, literally. This was a competition that they lost. That's me in 2007. Same area. My wife says I really looked extremely American then. So I don't, whatever that means. And then same footprint as that OMA Tower. This is Norman Foster's proposal. It was 700 meters tall, and is, I like to say, it tickled the troposphere. And just for reference, these trees you see in the base of this image, that's the same burial ground cemetery as Connie Bear proposed to shift to Malabar Hill's eastern slope. So I really like that connection between the two. It's quite a crazy thing to think, just in a historical blink of an eye, such different, vastly different proposals for the city. So that was all South Bombay, right? Now let's talk a little bit about the western edge of the city. So this is, of course, kind of the primordial city, multiple islands. Eventually, of course, the city is filled in, but we still have this rocky foreshore, right, for a large part of Bombay's history. This is what the Walkeshwar foreshore looked like in the late 1800s. This is also an image from the RMA archive, and yeah, I love this. This is the intertidal zone for those of you who are into marine life. In the 1870s, this gentleman, remember we're walking the street, now we're going to meet Arthur Crawford. Arthur Crawford has a plan for this western foreshore, and he writes about it in this book, The Development of New Bombay, and he calls it the Bombay Circular Road. And this is what he said. The Bombay Circular Road was to stretch from the yacht club around Colaba along the curvilinear profile of Back Bay and around Malabar Hill, thank you, then past the Walkeshwar temples by a series of reclamations of the bays and indentions to Mahalakshmi, right? So basically, he looked upon this foreshore, said if we just create one retaining wall, fill it up, put a road, we can traverse the city by this circular, by an almost coastal road. This was his plan. It looked something like this. Bizarrely similar, of course, to today's Mumbai coastal road. He went on, bays along the city's western foreshore were to be filled with excavated earth from tunnels cut into Malabar, Kumbala, and Worli hills. Right? So he proposed cutting all these holes into the hillsides through tunnels. Again, he wrote about it. He said drawings were made, but they were lost, so he made a speculation. This is how I thought, how I imagine his tunnel through Malabar Hill might have looked. And then Aniketu Maria developed it very beautifully like this. That was the reclamation line that Crawford imagined. Then it was all to be filled up with earth cut from this tunnel. And then he had one sneaky proposal. He said the Baikula Club should shift to the waterfront. And I find this really interesting because had that happened, I wonder what they would have called it, because Baikula is like a place. So it would have been the Baikula Club at Mahalakshmi. I don't know. And it's interesting because the same thing's happening now. If you're following the news, the Mahalakshmi racecourse is possibly being shifted to Uran or Kargar. And I wonder what they will call this racecourse then, still the Mahalakshmi racecourse. So interesting challenges. Of course, Crawford was unsuccessful, and in 1962, the government of Bombay invites Wilbur Smith and Associates to the city and says, make a traffic report, a traffic plan for us, please. We're about to enter this chaotic world of the motor car. So this is Mr. Smith. I really like him also. He was possibly one of the world's foremost traffic planners in the 1960s globally. He comes to Bombay for 18 months. His team studied the city, made proposals. I love this image though because he is terrified, right? He's in a room full of 4 women. That's all his wife and 3 daughters, and he is petrified. And I'll explain why I think that is. I have a rumor, an idea. So he's also from the great state of South Carolina, which is my home state, here in the east coast of US. It's about a 15-hour flight from Bombay. So he has just realized he has 15 hours on the flight with the 4 women in his family, and he is petrified. So I love that look. He's so powerful, but he's powerless. So that's Wilbur Smith. He studied the city extensively. What they did is they looked at the island city first and said everything in yellow is residential. And the trend at that time imagined was that the residential would move north to the suburbs. There'd be a lot of residences in the north. So he proposed this West Island Freeway, he calls it, so that people living in the north could go to the blue areas, the commercial districts in the south, right? And that was the assumed trend, that the blue would get more blue, the yellow would get more yellow. Hence, this West Island Freeway was proposed by Smith in the 1960s. And then the purple you see in the middle was industrial. It was more or less assumed the industry would just keep going as it is, as an industrial center. The plan was basically passed. amongst many other roads he proposed, that was one of them. And you see it here in the development plan published in 1967. That orange line on the left is Wilbur Smith's West Island Freeway, much like Arthur Crawford's Coastal Circular Road as well. The project started. The reclaimed area may become more posh than Malabar Hill, right? So imaginations went wild as this began. And just after Wilbur Smith left Bombay, this plan was floated and basically approved. It included 98 skyscrapers along the new road, the new freeway. Quite a wild plan. That's the reclamation line. Of course, part of the reclamation started, then it stalled. And this is what happened. Freeway plan revised, freeway plan sunk, freeway plan project condemned. Now they decide to pursue. No West Island Freeway. So it went back and forth extensively, right? This road. The deadline made by Smith was 1981, so the project has to be complete by then. Of course, that was missed. And in 1989, architect Hafiz contractor comes up with a plan of his own for this West Island, Western Foreshore edge. And he basically says it should be a series of extensive parks, 400 acres of public spaces, forest. There was also a road component, but by and large, this is what he imagined this western waterfront development would look like. And these drawings are by Mr. Ambedkar, who we're very happy to have here with us. These are some of my favorite drawings in all of Bombay Imagined, because they're just works of art, each and every one. This was the scheme at Mahalakshmi. Absolutely beautiful, beautiful drawings. This was Worli Fort, and kind of city park, part of the 400-acre reclamation. And so we published these images in the book, and then RMA wrote to me probably a couple months ago and said my father made these drawings, and I was so happy because I had no idea who made them. But I was very keen to find out, so RMA very kindly shared some of these sketches, and you can see the base sketch, and I really like it because it reminded me of the speculation process we went through. We have a sketch, and then it evolves into a final piece of art. So this is one of the sketches RMA shared with me, and then he recently showed me some of the works on Zoom, and they're absolutely beautiful. So really, really fabulous, fabulous work. Then when I re-looked at the pieces, I noticed the signatures there a bit good. So fabulous work. Thank you, sir, for everything you made for this project. So the West Island Freeway, then Hafiz's kind of coastal park, and now of course what's under construction is the Mumbai Coastal Road. It's Bombay's newest street. This is the plan today. Of course superimposed on the plan as Wilbur Smith imagined it. And remember, the blue was to become more blue, the yellow was to become more yellow for that coastal road plan to make sense. Unfortunately, the city didn't quite listen to what they had to do, and the yellow went everywhere. The blue kind of fragmented and went everywhere, and the industrial is very quickly shrinking. There's almost no purple in the center of the city anymore. 2018, the coastal road was inaugurated, and these are some recent drone images from the coastal road today. These I think are about a month or two old. This is the tunnel through Malabar Hill. It's basically complete, the core civil construction. I just love this image because I think Arthur Crawford, if you had told him, like, it'll happen, but you have to wait 150 years, like, wow, you know, amazing. It's just amazing. So that's the tunnel. This is at Priyadarshini Park. This is at Haji Ali and the Mahalakshmi Temple side. And then, of course, the bay at Haji Ali. Quite crazy. And you look at this, how the western edge of the city has changed, right? From that jagged, rocky foreshore to now this very smooth man-made line, much like Marine Drive's smooth arc. It's a huge transition that we are seeing, you know, in the last 2-3 years in the city's form. And that's, of course, the first image we saw, the foreshore. We'll close with Central Bombay, the center of the city. And we're going to come back to William Walker now for a couple of minutes. And this was Walker's vision for Bombay. Now, remember, Bombay's a bathtub, right? The center is the lowest point. It was always flooding in the monsoon. So Walker said, let's put the docks in the center of the city, the very center, let's draw all the commercial activity to the center of the city rather than south. Okay? And he said that would do a couple of things. One, it would be equidistant for residents everywhere throughout the island. And then two, we wouldn't have to reclaim Back Bay. There'd be no reclamation. And then we could just make this public space, right? That promenade he proposed, 30-meter wide green promenade. He said, well, then reserve the edges of the city for people, for recreation, and keep all the business, kind of the heavy-duty business in the very center of the city. Quite a fascinating plan. I like to think that Walker was basically Bombay's first sustainability consultant, passionate citizen. Of course, long before those words were used. And in much the same way that Charles Correa said, the edge of the city should be for people, right? Not for machines, designed not for the motor car, but for the individual, for city residents. So this was Walker's vision for Bombay, specifically for central Bombay. Of course, that didn't happen. Reclamation happened in the south. The commercial areas went south, and the center remained this kind of no man's land until it became an industrial center. Of course, then by the 90s, industry was on its way out, and we have this unique challenge in the 1990s. What do we do with hundreds of acres of land that has no industrial use in the heart of the city? Of course, Charles Correa then formed a committee, and they said each plot of land should have basically 3 different types of uses. Should have 1, public use, parks, open spaces, green space. 2, Mata housing, public housing, right? And 3rd, 1 component should also be for commercial development. And as an additional layer, they made this whole network of green spaces, of public thoroughfares that were landscaped extensively. And this was like a gigantic master plan they made. I think it might have been the world's largest urban land recycling scheme in history. And these were some of the visuals. This was public housing. This was commercial spaces within existing mill buildings. And then, of course, the interiors of some mill buildings, they said, also should be preserved and developed as new commercial centers as well. And they said this, instead of a meaningless hodgepodge of development, large and viable parcels of land can be made available in a pattern which makes overall urban sense for the city, right? A nice, simple vision. Unfortunately, of course, that didn't happen. Vast majority of the land has gone for commercial development. This is a recent image from central Bombay. The Correa Committee went on to say this: it must be emphasized that this redevelopment addresses an issue of critical importance in the mill area, viz. Pedestrian movement, particularly from the railway stations to the mills and proposed new employment centers. Right? So this was one of the core focus, how people move through the city from point A to point B. They took this particular plot as an example from the railway station. They said, let's have this wide green thoroughfare to go to SB Marg. And these were some of the visuals, like very nice, pleasant, open public spaces to make movement of pedestrians pleasant, enjoyable. And then this is today. This image is from a couple of years ago. It's awful. The same route is just really, it's a miserable experience. And hundreds, thousands of people, of course, do this every day. 1945, there were also plans for really wide streets with many users. This was a communications panel that was formed, and this is the section they made. These roads were to crisscross the entire city, and there were to be footpaths, lanes for animal-drawn vehicles, cycle tracks, slow and fast traffic, and of course, greenery. This was a really radical plan. It's unfortunately, I suspect World War II and the fiscal problems kind of stalled that completely. And this leads to the existential question, why did the Bombayite cross the road, right? And the answer is obvious, he didn't, because there was nowhere to cross. This is Tulsi Pipe Road today. It's a very difficult road to cross with my colleague, Mokshit. We've tried many times, and it's really, really painful. And this infuriated, this condition of the struggle of the pedestrian on the street, it infuriated this man, Ajit Bhattacharjee. And he was an editor at the Times of India, the resident editor, in the 1970s, and he went nuts. He said basically, there should be no private car ownership in the island city, period. Everyone should travel by public transport. And he imagined this car-free Bombay. And I like to think he would have looked upon this scene, Tulsi Pipe Road, and imagined it to look like this, right? And he said, essentially there should be one lane for bus movement, for bus transport. Everything else should be turned into urban parks where the elderly can walk peacefully, children can play, people can get fresh air and exercise. And he was completely sincere in this proposal. He was not just, flying a kite. He pushed for it, he wrote about it. It never happened, of course, and this is what he said: nothing would suffer seriously except the self-esteem of a few. I really find this inspirational. This idea of getting cars off the streets has also, of course, been a favorite of many architects and city residents and planners. This is the Mahalakshmi overbridge. If you know, it's also quite a chaotic point. This on the left is Mahalakshmi Station. And Abraham John Architects, a firm in the city, proposed this to make it a fully pedestrian bridge. And it's interesting and relevant because the bridge has been deemed structurally unsafe. It's planned to be demolished, but of course it would be safe for only pedestrian use. So there's been talk of it. Let's see whether this materializes in the future, but not at all impossible. This is when that same bridge lands at Satrasta. This was their imagination for this culmination of the pedestrian pathway into this large circular public park. But my favorite, and the last project we'll look at this evening, is this from 1921, a plant for Bombay in 1971. And this speculation was made by Akhil. He's a graphic visual artist based out of Calicut. And he created this piece. It's really, really detailed and quite beautiful. And what I love about this is it just takes cars off the street altogether and puts them in the sky. It was a plan by a Bombay resident who had this vision of aerial taxis, the entirety of Back Bay. Much like Robert Fairbairn's plan, all the Back Bay was to be reclaimed, made into this gigantic park. The streets were to be very systematic. There were to be parklets between many streets and neighborhoods. It was just this very futuristic vision for the city. As you can see, the creator was anonymous. But this is, I'll read, this is what he wrote in the local paper. I had fallen off the seat on which I had gone to sleep on Malabar Point and had rolled down the slope. Only the railings had stopped me from falling into the sea. I staggered to my feet and looked wildly around. Yes, I had been dreaming. I love that because I'm a dreamer, right? Like literally, I have dreams. So I fully believe he had this dream. He was suffering in Bombay and he had this dream of a better city and how it could have been, and then he wrote about it, and now we've created this speculation of his Bombay. So many of these projects are, of course, in Bombay Imagined. It's 200 plans for the city from 1670 to 2020, 350 years. There are also, of course, many projects for the north, for the suburbs. There are projects for the eastern edge of the island, the eastern waterfront, which will be kind of the city's final frontier in terms of development. And I'll just close by introducing some of the team behind the book. There were in total about 50 to 55 people involved. It was a huge, huge team over 7 years. This is Aniket Umaria. He made many of the speculations you saw, the visualizations, that tunnel through Malabar Hill. That's his masterpiece. I think he made about 20 artworks in the book. He's really talented. Deshna Mehta and Carol Nair were the book designers. So if you open the book and see it and you feel it looks nice and calm, it's their handiwork. So think of them. And then this is Fawaz Khan. He was basically project manager, but the book happened because of him. He made it his own and was just really, he held it all together. So he unfortunately couldn't make it tonight, but really, really grateful for Fawaz. And this is the team behind the printing of the book, the actual physical production. I consider working with this team one of the highlights of my life. They made each book a work of art, and I have a few copies here if you want to just browse and see it. Each book is handmade. It's absolutely incredible what they did and with such care. Every word is handwritten. I love writing. Like, I love the actual act of physically handwriting. There are about 62,000 words in Bombay Imagined, all written between 5 a.m. and 7 a.m., much of it in the pandemic. And W.H. Auden had this to say: "Most people enjoy the sight of their own handwriting as they enjoy the smell of their own farts." And I think that's true. I love handwriting. I look at my hand, I just think, like, it looks so nice. So this is it. Bonnie Stevens, our cat, she went over every word in the book, and she's a copycat, but we're grateful for all her inputs. She is, of course, on top of everything. And then, of course, my wife Tina and son Kairav have just been supportive every step of the process in producing this work. So we will end there. Thank you all very much for coming and listening, and love to chat with any of you afterwards. Thank you.
Hello. So I was just wanted to ask you why this proposal was not into the picture, or whether there was a kind of a corruption things which happened there.
So the footpath, speakers with the footpath higher and the other one lower, so that was a pretty clear case of corruption. The Bombay builders said a couple of things. One, the contractors didn't look at drawings, which for any architects is like an eternal problem. So the contractor didn't look at the drawings. They used substandard material. So the commissioners proposed a certain material, and they got some, B-class, C-class material. And then the actual installation was also just very shoddy. So there's every problem you could imagine happened. So that was one case. And then others is a wide range. Sometimes they're too expensive. Abraham John Architects' proposal for that Mahalakshmi Bridge. My analysis, it's just so much politics in a lot of projects that is just, it's sometimes very challenging to get things done.
Yes.
So Charles Correa said, J.R.D. Tata, he didn't say why, but all we know is he selected, in Correa's words, a C-rate or a C-class architect out of Chicago. That's it. I don't know why. Maybe he didn't like Corbusier, he didn't like the way he talked, maybe. I'm really not sure. Maybe his fees were too high. But Correa said Tata turned down the world's greatest architect at the height of his career. Amazing. And got a C rate for Chicago. So, yeah. So every now when I see the ability, I just think of that. C rate. In his words.
Hello. So tell us about the dream which you had, which brought you to Mumbai.
The dream didn't bring me.
Yeah.
It was a coincidence. A providential tinkering.
For me, I'm also an architect, but maybe not much fascinated by streets, maybe more into buildings. Okay. So I just want to understand what changes in your mind when you take a decision in your life. That when you're working around design of streetscapes. What motivates you? I don't know what pushed you towards that particular direction.
So one clarification, I'm not a street designer. I would like to be, but I don't have faith right at the moment that if I invested my time in street design, it would happen, unfortunately. So I'm not a street designer, so I don't know if I can answer any other part of your question.
No issues.
Sorry. But I like streets, right? And I like walking. I love walking. I'm an introvert, so I love to go on walks by myself. I love it. So every weekend, like when I first came to Bombay, I was in office for 5 days, around people all the time, all over. And I go for a walk for 2 days by myself. And it was great because I got to know the city through that process, and I got to know it, I think, fairly well. So I really enjoyed that time. So I'm not an expert on design, but I'm an expert on walking.
How to compile the whole presentations? It must be a long time.
Yeah.
So how did you make it?
Yeah, so one, I had no timeline. I had no, I'm going to start and finish
Hello, yeah. I have a question.
Yes.
That was a wonderful presentation to start with. Thank you so much for the insight.
Thank you.
Well, the question is that you have been telling that you want a past of Bombay or Mumbai. How far do you see Mumbai 50 years down the line, after 50 years?
It's a very dangerous question.
Your perception.
My perception, yeah. It's not going to be overly hopeful, I will say that. I wish it were. I'm generally an optimist. Like I function, I literally forget bad memories. Like my wife is astounded by this. However, I don't foresee dramatic change in the near future because dramatic change needs a certain mindset towards a different way of life, and I don't see that anywhere in leadership. Any leadership. There are moments of hope throughout the city. There are aberrations, right? And to get them done, people have to fight so hard to get little meaningful things done that are for the greater good, not for a profit or anyone's own agenda. So I don't have a terribly hopeful imagination. I'm not dwelling on that extensively. I will say this though, there are countless thinkers and residents who have hopeful visions for the city that are willing to work towards that. If just we have that paired with our positions to achieve those ends, that's the synergy that's missing. So if that synergy can be achieved, it can be one of the most physically fascinating places in the world. If that doesn't happen, it will be a great city like it is today with construction everywhere and this gray layer of dust over everything. So time will tell. Sorry for the dark foreboding vision. So I like history in general. I don't really know why. And I remember I used to read a lot about the history of slavery, right? Especially as a white person, like we really, our history is horrific in the US. So I've been really fascinated with just history in general, and when Bombay became home, it was just a natural extension to seek out the city's history. But more than history is a little bit of a boring word. I really like people, which is why I find Robert Stephans' story fascinating. Because we work in Fort. Like now when I walk through the lanes of Fort, I think I wonder which shed he was sitting under in the monsoon. And we see people day-to-day lives and we judge them, right? We have that person's poor, they're not thinking, they don't have brains, maybe if we're honest with ourselves, that's what we're often thinking, even if it's subconsciously. And I'm sure people thought that at Fairburn at the time. Here's this man sitting in this shed, creating, some of the wildest plans for Bombay, and genuinely creating them with deep thought, engineering merit. So I like especially these kind of historical surprises because I think it challenges us to interact differently with the world around us. And it's a good challenge, I think.
That was a wonderful evening indeed. My question goes with, have you come across anything related to the Dadar Matuga Badala Science Scheme that was proposed? And that was probably the first affordable housing scheme in the 1920s, I would say. Dadar, at the heart of Dadar we see Shivaji Park.
Yeah.
So Shivaji Park is also a very important public space as well as a very important biodiversity park if we see it right now. So if you did come across anything, is there anything in Bombay Imagined? Are we going to see about it?
So I came across the research stage was really bizarre because it was fascinating. The drawings were fascinating and I was so disappointed because most of it happened. Right? But it was of course good for the city that something was planned and executed. But it's not in the book because to a large extent it was realized. There is a lot of material on Tahari because I love reading recent articles about Tahari because journalists will say the first master plan was proposed in 2012. It's no, that's bad journalism. The first was in 1920. There were 500 residents. There was no man's land, and there was a master plan to develop this
Thank you. Actually, when we first had us during the lockdown, and we had a webinar which was almost on a similar topic, we just that I proposed that one day we get into the Darbar Hall, in person. And today, really thank Robert for making that happen. Today we just proposed again to Robert that one day we go on a walk with him through these dreamed streets of Mumbai, and hopefully make that happen very soon. But I want to thank on behalf of the Asiatic Society of Mumbai, the Mumbai Research Centre, and all the participants here. I want to thank Robert to, first of all, be willing to and also to take the time to present this here in front of us. And I'm sure some of us will take it forward with him as we meet more dreamers and thinkers and people who will dream with you through the streets of Mumbai. And I think the Mumbai Research Centre aspires to be that one platform where these people can come together and at least connect. If not, we don't know whether we can be that powerful position as we have to influence, but we will surely be that platform to at least for people to meet and connect with each other. And with that hope, we hope that we keep in touch. And thank you all for coming. And just keep in, if you want to get in touch with our future events, the Jashan Mumbai events and also the Asiatic events, there is a link which we have put up outside. You can scan on it. We are on Instagram, we are on